This could quite possibly be one of the most important things I ever say in my entire life. Here we go. I'm going to tie all this in at the end, and you're going to see why I'm going through this, specifically why this matters to you and any sort of mental health problem that you've had, especially if you've been given a diagnosis. And I'm also going to talk about where I think all of these belief systems come from and what they're rooted in. So there's just so much to say. I don't believe any of this is rooted in wellness. I don't believe it's rooted in evil either. But I do think that the mental health profession has not been great at prioritizing true support and wellness. I think a lot of this is rooted in something else, which I will talk about at the end. So if it looks like I keep looking off to the side, it's because I have my laptop right here. And I'm going to read a bunch of quotes. I have a couple of sources here, and I'll link in the description. We have a tendency to take everything that we're told as fact. We also have a tendency to look to the past and to look to history and kind of laugh at how ignorant people were. And we look at practices in the past, scientific beliefs, we look at people who believed the world was flat and we laugh at them. We look at people who used to believe in medical procedures like bloodletting. We think that's silly. We think we're so smart in this culture, and somehow we never ever see the current identical situations going on because we believe that we now know everything. And so we don't see how this extreme ignorance and bias is still at play in the medical field, sometimes in the scientific field. Specifically, what I want to talk about is the mental health field, so psychology, psychiatrists, psychologists, all that, and just the cultural perception of people with differences. So I want to start with the first term, which I didn't even know about this term until I stumbled upon it. It's called hospitalism. So this was a pediatric diagnosis used in the 1930s to describe infants who wasted away in the hospital. It is now understood that this wasting away was mostly caused by a lack of social contact between infant and caregiver. So in the 1930s, we literally had babies dying in hospitals because adults didn't realize that they needed human contact. So anyone who's really empathic that's watching this, that is absolutely mind-blowing. We had children dying in hospitals because people didn't realize they needed social contact, specifically with their mothers. We now know this, but still hospitals sometimes don't prioritize it quite as much as a lot of midwives and professionals in that field think that they should. This is why a lot of people are choosing home births and things like that. So hospitalism, they give it this name, like we know what's happening here, right? So in this institution of the hospital that's supposed to be taking care of us, we're using these highly technical terms like hospitalism to try to explain something that's going on, and in reality it's like it was so basic human nature, common sense. It's mind-blowing. Okay, 2. The term imbecile was once used by psychiatrists to denote a category of people with moderate to severe intellectual disability, as well as a type of criminal. The word arises from the Latin word imbecilis, meaning weak or weak-minded. So, in other words, people who are intellectually different than us are weak. popularized by psychologist Henry Goddard and was used in 1927 by the Supreme Justice Court to rule forced sterilization. So essentially, someone was forced to have an operation on their body because they were an imbecile. This is 1927, okay? This was a psychologist who came up with this term and this idea, which, I mean, there's nothing underneath this. This is just pure bias. 3, homosexuality. The American Psychiatric Association listed homosexuality in the DSM-1 in 1952, but that classification came under scrutiny eventually. Subsequent studies consistently failed to produce any empirical or scientific evidence that homosexuality was anything besides a natural and normal sexual orientation. In 1974, a vote was held to amend homosexuality's place in the DSM. So that means that up until 1974, we believed homosexuality was a mental disorder. In 2012, the DSM removed gender identity disorder. So that means until 2012, people were not allowed to become a different gender without being regarded as sick. Next one, female hysteria. This was once a common medical diagnosis for women, which was described as exhibiting a wide array of symptoms. These are great: anxiety, shortness of breath, fainting, nervousness, sexual desire, insomnia, fluid retention, heaviness of the abdomen, irritability, loss of appetite for food or sex. So sexual desire or lack of sexual desire are symptoms. Sexually forward behavior and a tendency to cause trouble for others. It is no longer recognized. Its diagnosis and treatment were routine for hundreds of years in Western Europe. Women of independent mind were often diagnosed with the vapors. So this is slightly different than female hysteria. This is the vapors. Suffragettes were particularly vulnerable to this disease, given the wide range of symptoms. Vapors diagnosis often impeded the identification of more serious medical conditions. So in other words, we're saying we're giving women mental health disorders and ignoring their physical health diseases that could kill them, like cancer. Don't worry, guys, there's one in here for you. Male hysteria. So this was a debated topic around the turn of the century. It was originally believed that men could not suffer from this and only women could because they had a uterus. This belief was discarded in the 17th century. Blah, 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 blah. In the early 20th century, male hysteria morphed into shell shock. This reflected a changing perception of the disease, losing its feminine connotations. This new form of male hysteria was made honorable. In 1980s, shell shock gave way to PTSD. The progression has been a slow shift from the feminine stigma associated with the disease. So in other words, we started letting men admit that they had PTSD around the 1980s because we no longer saw it as feminine. And lastly, I saved this for last because this is the example to end all examples. This next term I can't even pronounce. It is obviously just a made-up term by some white man. From Popular Southern Magazine. So this was widely published and distributed. This is not like some weird the weird ramblings of some guy. This is like the Time magazine of 1851. This was written by Dr. Cartwright. It's called Diseases and Peculiarities of the Negro Race. So I'm just gonna pull a few quotes. Every sentence is absolutely insane, but we don't have time to read it all, so I'm just gonna read some of it. This disease is accompanied by physical signs or lesions of the body discoverable to the medical observer, which are always present. So he's saying these African American people who have this mental health disease always have lesions on them, which doctors have discovered, supposedly. The northern physicians and people have noticed the symptoms, but not the disease from which they spring. So it's saying people in the north, quote, ignorantly attribute the symptoms to the debasing influence of slavery on the mind. So he's saying people of the north believe that African American people are acting crazy because they're slaves, so they're upset. And this doctor is saying that's not true. They have this condition which makes them inferior. He goes on to talk about all these situations where African American people are acting crazy and trying to escape. Quote, with the advantages of proper medical advice strictly followed, this troublesome practice that many Negroes have of running away can be almost entirely prevented. Nowadays, we would call this belief rooted in eugenics. So eugenics is a term that now many associate with white supremacy. The eugenics movement became associated with Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, where many of the defendants at the Nuremberg trials attempted to justify their human rights abuses by claiming there was little difference between Nazi eugenics and the United States eugenics programs. I guess they tried to justify the Holocaust by saying, hey, you do it to African Americans, we can do it to Jewish people. I highly recommend that you click and read that PBS article. I'll link it down below. Diseases and Peculiarities of the Negro Race. So we have African Americans, we have men who have been to war, we have all women, suffragettes especially, we have homosexual and people having gender dysphoria, we have imbeciles, or people with different cognitive intellectual abilities, and then we have the example of the babies who just needed some nurturing in the hospital. These are some of the most obvious examples of bias. We mistakenly believe that that sort of bias is over, and it's not. It's everywhere still. It's just slightly different. It's a little bit more subtle. The question is, do you believe that all of these people really suffered with disorders? Or do you think that something else was going on? Essentially, they were either working through some trauma, they were different than the people who diagnosed them. So really there was nothing wrong to begin with except that they were different from the people who were in charge and had the education to diagnose them with something. So in other words, they were not cooperative, right? And this leads me to the underlying framework under all of these, which is that these people were believed to be interrupting the Industrial Revolution, the ideology behind the Industrial Revolution, which was produce as much as you can, everyone work really hard, in factories, have a nuclear family, reproduce, your kids have to do the same thing, just make money for the country. Be productive. We still are in that heavy bias in the Western world. And what was supposedly wrong with all of these people is that they were interrupting that ideology. So think of the men, we can go through every example. The men who went away to war and basically had trauma about it. They could no longer fight in wars and kill and conquer and win and defeat everyone, right? They were struggling, and so they were becoming disordered, or reality, they were traumatized, and so they could no longer contribute to this divide and conquer agenda. Same with the women. Women are like the least likely, women are like the least likely group on earth to contribute to any sort of oppressive, dominant, violent agenda. Women are just not naturally a part of war, destruction, aggression, Even like being nonstop producers, right? That's not in the nature of the female. We have cycles where we have productive phases, and then we have phases where we have to rest because we're menstruating, right? So again, the nature of the female was essentially not good for this system. And so females were basically told, I think it was like a third of them or a quarter of them have hysteria, right? They're essentially throwing a wrench in this agenda that we have in the West. And by we, I mean people in power, people in charge of things, property owners, right? Same with African Americans who wanted to just have lives, to be treated like humans as opposed to, worse than animals. They were interrupting this system. Whenever they would refuse to be slaves or producers of the wealth, they were told that they were inferior, told that stupidness of mind is actually a term that is literally used in one of these sources I have. And it's that if you're not producing for us, you don't have any value, is essentially what it was, particularly in the African American example. What about homosexuality and gender dysphoria, right? These people are interrupting the agenda by not conforming to the nuclear family. So think about it. If you're gay, or if you don't identify to what you were biologically born as, you're interrupting this neat and easy nuclear family. So what I mean by that is male, female, and like 2 kids, right? We have the male that works, the female that stays home and pops out the babies, and then the 2 kids grow up and they meet partners and do the same thing. So it's like this production line. Now, if you're gay or questioning or whatever, you're probably not going to want to produce that. I want you to look at what you've been diagnosed with, if anything, or what you believe to be wrong with you. I want you to look at what you believe to be wrong with you and ask yourself this question: how am I interrupting that system? How am I interrupting production, generating profit, staying within the lines, marriage, having kids, paying for college, going into a bunch of debt, buying things, being a consumer? How is my disorder interrupting my ability to produce and be a consumer? When we wholeheartedly buy into these systems, we're denying our own reality. If our own reality steps outside that system at all, we're saying it's wrong or it doesn't exist, it's broken, it's not real, we have to get rid of it. Looking at all the destruction this has caused, using the most obvious examples in here are Nazi Germany, slavery in the Western world. These are catastrophic examples of how bias can become fact, right? Bias becomes supposed fact. Everyone buys into it and cooperates. And then we have this world where these people are broken, these people are not broken, and the ones who are not broken can try to subject the others to their reality. It's forced conformity is what it is. So if you're someone who suffers from basically anything, if you have any addiction, if you are depressed, if you have any supposed anxiety disorder, it does not benefit the system for you to take time out and get to know yourself and get to know why those things are happening, because in a sense you're pulling away from the collective, at least temporarily, to explore what's actually true for you and what's actually best for you. So because that is a threat to conformity, it gives off this fear response in other people, especially people in positions of power, who are controlling things. I want people to make sure that your treatment plan Whether you picked it, whether someone else gave it to you, especially if someone else gave it to you, is it a treatment plan or is it a conformity plan? Is it designed to get you back at work, back functioning? That's a red flag. Anything that is designed to get you functioning again quickly is a red flag. That's not real treatment. If you see a lot of these, like I see a lot of commercials for like depression treatment, even like some physical disease treatment, they always focus on getting you back on your feet. And it's like this woman was grieving and she wasn't able to get out of bed. And then all of a sudden she takes the pill, and then 5 days later she's at work and she's running and she's doing 15 things again. Healing is not the same as getting a lot done. Productivity is not healing. When you heal, you will naturally be more productive, but it'll be in a way that is productive for you. It'll fuel you. It won't be productive for someone else's benefit, right? This is not about who you work for. This is not about serving your family until you have nothing left. This extreme service model that the Western world was built on is absolutely killing us. And if we can realize that in time, we can move ourselves back into balance. But if we continue to believe that I'm sick, I'm weak, I'm stupid of mind, and I just have to do everything my doctor says, even though I hate it, even though it doesn't work, even though it makes me feel terrible and worthless, I just have to keep labeling myself with these terms that individuals came up with. So if you go through every term on this list that I just did, all of these are terms that one man came up with. This is one man's interpretation of an entire reality that you're experiencing, and he has not experienced it. He's just doing research, just kind of looking at it from his lens, from his cultural bias, from his cultural standpoint of power, essentially, of being, a scientist, a doctor, a physician, whatever he was at that time. And he's giving it a name that benefits him. Labels do not benefit you. Just like none of these women who are diagnosed with female hysteria, or these babies that were diagnosed with hospitalism, they did not benefit from that. They suffered, and they were neglected by the systems that were supposed to be supporting them, right? The Hippocratic Oath is do no harm. If you're labeling someone and immediately doing harm, are you healing them, or are you preventing them from healing?